Hello, welcome to another online lecture on principles of computer security. In today's lesson, we are going to discuss about digital signatures. In previous weeks, we have discussed about public key cryptography, and in that we briefly touched upon that digital signatures is one of the ways how it can be used. So in today's lesson, we are going to go into a bit more detail into digital signatures and see how they work and where they are used. So when we think about digital signatures, we can think of it in many ways as analogous to what we do with normal signatures on papers. So why do we use normal signatures on papers? One of the main purpose is to prove that a person who says that is the person. So it is to prove as a way of proving the identity. Say, for example, one of the common places where you may have come across using a signature, handwritten signature, is at a bank. So at the point of making withdrawals, for example, the bank may want you to place a signature and they may verify it with a signature that they have on file to see if those things match up. And if later on somebody goes and says it is not me who put the signature, then that could be a problem, and that is where certain other actions will have to be taken. But the basic functionality is that. Similarly, with digital signatures, also, we are trying to achieve a fairly similar outcome. So the main thing that we try to achieve, particularly in terms of communications using digital signatures, is the ability to prove the origin of a message, saying that this message actually comes from me, and somebody else should be able to verify that. And then also, it will help sort of alleviate any sort of possibilities that I may deny sending a message, for example, any sort of later dispute. So, for example, if a message has my digital signature, then a third party can verify that it is actually coming from me. Similarly, if I later on go and say that it is not from me, then if they have the digital signature also along with that, then they can say if it is having your digital signature, then it must be from you. So it serves those two purposes when it comes to communication. So what we essentially do with this is we are trying to bind an entity. So we are trying to bind an entity and to a message. So for example, if a message is from me and my identity as the sender, a digital signature is going to bridge those things together or create a bind between those two points. So in the overall use of digital signatures, we will have what is known as two parties. One is the signer, that is the entity who is going to create the digital signature. So the signer is the one who creates the digital signature, and then the verifier is the entity that is actually receiving the message. So it is the receiver, and then they will do some checks to verify that the message is actually coming from the signer. So, if we look at a more formalized definition for electronic signatures, that is coming from the European Community Directive on Electronic Signatures, it defines it as data in electronic form attached to or logically connected with other electronic data which serves as a method of authentication. So we will have some original electronic data that we are communicating. So that is the, say, if you are sending a message or something, so that is the original electronic data. Then with that, another part of electronic data will be either attached or somehow it is connected to that. And the main purpose of this data is essentially ensuring some form of authentication happens between the signer and the verifier, or it can be authenticated that the signer is the person who is sending the message. So that is the main purpose. So that is one of the sort of formalized definitions that we have for electronic signatures. Then they also define another concept called an advanced electronic signature, whereby they extend the previous definition a little further, and they bring in a certain other sort of requirements or aspects into electronic signature. So that is, it should be uniquely linked to a signatory. So that is, if a signer and a verifier is there, the signature should be uniquely linked to the signatory. And with the digital signature, it should be able to verify, or it should be able to identify who the signatory is. Say, for example, if I make the digital signature, then it should be linked to my identity. Then it should also be possible to verify and identify that it is me who has put that digital signature. And this can only happen if we can ensure that the digital signature can only be created under the control of the signatory. So that is an important requirement that we would have. That is, it's not just linked to me and it is identifiable that it is from me, but it is also necessary to ensure that only me and only under my control this digital signature can be created. If that is not the case, then the uniqueness and all those things may be irrelevant because someone else could create that digital signature. So then that is also an important part. And the last requirement is, if we create a digital signature for a particular message or particular piece of data, and there are some subsequent changes to that data at a later point in time, then that change should be detectable from the original digital signature. So if there's even a small change in the data, it should be detected by the change in the digital signature. The original digital signature would become invalid, so it will not be verifiable. So that is also a requirement. So these four things in a way would define what we would expect from an electronic signature or a digital signature infrastructure when we want to use it. So when we think about it in terms of some security requirements that we would have for a digital signature mechanism or digital signature infrastructure, we can identify a couple of key requirements. One is the data origin authentication of the signer. So when we talk about data origin authentication of the signer, what we want here is, with a digital signature, we should be able to validate the message and assure that the message has not changed and the message was originally signed by the specified entity. For example, if I send you a message with a corresponding digital signature, you should be able to verify that it was sent by me and the message has not been altered after I have sent it to you. So that is one requirement from the receiver's point of view. The receiver should be able to verify. On the other hand, once I place a digital signature on a message and I send it to you, later on, it should not be possible for me to claim that I did not send the message. Because as we earlier identified, we already have a requirement that is only under my control this digital signature should be placed. So in that case, if a digital signature is placed for a particular message and it could be verified, then I should not be able to uh, repudiate. I should be able to refuse or disagree with the message saying I didn't send that. So again, that is another thing that we would be able to verify. That is another requirement that we would have from digital signatures. So this would be very much a useful tool if we think about it. Say again, if we go back to the example of placing signature on withdrawal slips at a bank or any sort of financial transactions, if it is a handwritten signature, the number of these things cannot be ensured. Say, for example, maybe if somebody else learns to place my signature, then they could say, like somebody else could come and place my signature and do certain things with that. But we don't want that happening with digital signatures. We should be able to verify the signer, the signer, we should be able to verify. Similarly, on a paper signature, uh, I could say, no, I didn't sign that. Somebody must have put a fake signature there. Again, with digital signatures, we don't want that situation happening. If a signature is there for a message, then and it can be verified that it was placed by me, then I cannot repudiate that at a later stage. So, when we want to create a digital signature, there are two things that we would want to have, we would use as inputs in creating the digital signature. So the first part is essentially the data or the message, anything that we are communicating, we are sending. So that is the part of the information that will be used to produce the digital signature. So the digital signature will depend on the corresponding data. So not like a handwritten signature that is always the same. Digital signatures will depend on the origin data that we are sending, and depending on how, if the data changes, the corresponding digital signature will also change. In terms of communication, we may send those two things. The message and the corresponding signature may be sent separately or together, so that is a different thing. But the signature itself and the computation of the signature will use the message as one of the inputs. In addition to that, the digital signature will also need to use some secret parameter that is only known to the signer. Because only if we use a secret parameter that is only known to the signer, then we can have the requirement, or we can satisfy the requirement of non repudiation. So, that is, if the signature was created using a secret that is only known to me, then I cannot claim at a later stage saying I didn't place that signature. That because like because it is a secret only known to me, then the signature must have come from me. this requirement may sometime be avoided, or there may be an exception for this requirement in the case of certain cases. One example would be digital certificates. Uh, we will discuss about that at a later stage as well, where certain trusted parties will be able to place signatures for some other parties, but there will be certain formalized procedures for that, and verification of those also will have certain formalized procedures. But there should still be some form of secret parameter that is associated with a particular signer, so that it can be verified later on, and it cannot be repudiated later on. Then, when we think about placing digital signatures, uh, we can have a couple of different ways of implementing digital signature mechanisms. So, one of the options, one of the ways that we can use digital signatures is what we call as arbitrated digital signatures. So, when we say arbitrated digital signatures, what we have here is, so we have the signer who is going to send the message and also produce the digital signature, and a verifier who is going to receive the message and then verify the digital signature with the corresponding message. But in addition to these two parties, we are going to have another third party known as an arbiter. So, what will happen is the arbiter serves as an intermediary, and first the message sent from the signer will go to the arbiter, and the arbiter can do some initial verifications and then further pass it on to the verifier or the receiver. And all the communications will happen through this third party. But when we think about the digital signature infrastructures that are most commonly used, the vast majority of them do not involve having a third party, a trusted third party in between. So, the one of the main requirements with using an arbiter is it must be a trusted arbiter. And so we should place our trust in a third party to do the verification there. So, what we would use, or what we would prefer in terms of true, what we call as true digital signatures, here we would not use a trusted arbiter, and the people who are sending and receiving would be able to perform their own verifications at both ends. And these true digital signatures, it can be seen as almost a reverse of what we discussed in public key encryption. Particularly, the requirements that we have for true digital signatures can be seen as the total opposite of what we have as requirements for public key encryption. So, in public key encryption, if you remember that, anyone can encrypt the message and send it, and only the receiver can decrypt and see. Whereas in digital signatures, only the sender can use the secret to create the message or sign the message, but anyone can verify the message. So the operations in terms of the secrecy is reversed, whereby in publicly encryption, only like anyone can create or anyone can encrypt the message, whereas in true digital signatures, it is anyone can verify the signature. And when we talk about digital signatures here onwards, we are essentially going to talk about true digital signatures. So, if we briefly think about an example of how we may use a digital signature in practice, let's start with an example where Bob wants to send a message to Alice, but they also want to sign the message. So the message is produced. Then, after when the message is produced, it is sent through a cryptographic hash function to produce a hash. And then that hash will be used as an input to a digital signature generation algorithm, which would also use the Bob's private key, which is the secret that is only known to Bob, to generate the signature. Here, one of the important things that you can see is we use a cryptographic hash functions, and only the hash of the message is being used as part of the digital signature generation. So, what this ensures is even when we have significantly larger messages, the signature doesn't have to be large. If we use an appropriate cryptographic hash function and we can produce a significantly shorter hash text, for example, then the corresponding digital signature can also be significantly shorter, even for a much larger message. So that is the sending part. So there, what would happen is Bob would combine both of these things, the message and the signature, and they will send it to Alice. And at the receiving end, Alice is going to receive now both of these things, the message and the signature. Both of these things are going to be received by Alice. Then, here, what essentially Alice is going to do is they are going to create the signature that was created by, or they are going to verify the signature that was created by Bob using Bob's public key. So, Bob used the private key to sign. We will use Bob's public key to verify. So, what we would do is we would take the message and again use a hash function to create a hash. Then that hash will be used in a digital signature verification algorithm to see if the signature that was received is a valid signature. So essentially, with the use of this public key and private key, but used in the reverse order, that is, the sender is using the private key to create the signature, the receiver is using the public key to do the verification. If you remember correctly, in public key cryptography, we did in a way did the reverse, whereby senders, or if you person who is encrypting, would use the public key to encrypt and send something, and the receiver would use the private key to decrypt and see the message. Whereas here we would use the opposite, where we use the private key to create the secret, or as the secret to create the signature, and the public key as the public information to verify the signature as authentic. So, what we would require from a digital signature is it must satisfy a number of requirements. If we think about message authentication can protect two parties who are exchanging messages from any sort of interference from a third party. However, it does not protect the two parties against each other. So, if one of the parties are behaving maliciously, then there is no protection against that. But in such situations, using digital signature can become a solution because digital signatures provide a number of properties that would satisfy or that will alleviate the potentials for any sort of problems between two party communications, even if one party may attempt to misbehave, so to speak. So, with digital signatures, it must be verifiable. The author must be verified, and along with date and time of the signature, it must be possible to authenticate the contents at the time of the signature. So, if the message has changed after the signature was created, then that should be verifiable. And it should also be verifiable by third parties. So, not just the sender and the receiver can verify, any third party should also be able to verify, because the verification is happening using the public key, which can be known to any third parties. So, even the third parties can do the verification on behalf of the receiver. So, able to verify the author, able to authenticate the content, and also able to verify and do these things by a third party also. So this ensures that in two party communications, either party cannot back out from sort of their part in ensuring an agreeable communication happening. So, when we think about potential risks or potential attacks that can happen against digital signature infrastructures or digital signature mechanisms, uh, let's think about an example of communication happening between A and B, and let's assume a malicious third party C is in between this communication and may try to do some attacks. So let's look at some scenarios as to what can happen in this case. So one of the things what we would call as a key only attack is when C only knows, the third party only knows A's public key. No other information is known, but they know the public key, because public key is normally known by anyone, so can be known by anyone. It's not a secret. So C can know the public key. So that is sort of the very basic starting point. Another step further would be what is known as known message attacks. So when we talk about known message attacks, here what we have is C has access to a set of messages and their corresponding signatures. So if they have access to a set of messages and their corresponding signatures, can they use that information to deduce the underlying digital signature algorithms and how it works and reverse the process there? Then the third option is C would choose what is known as the generic chosen message attack, where C would choose a list of messages that are already known, predefined, or either well known or what would be commonly expected in a communication. That is something that they can predict. And with that, now they would know the message, and they may also know the public key, and they may also get the corresponding digital signatures. So with the combination of these things, can they attempt to break the signature scheme? Then another form of attack, what we would identify as the directed chosen message attack. So this is also very much similar to the generic chosen message attack, but with a slight differentiation that the messages to be signed are chosen after the public key is known. So it depends on what information is available to see, and what can they how they can go about in attempting to breaking the signature scheme. Then the last scheme, or the last type of attack, is what is known as the adaptive chosen message attack. And here what happens is C is allowed to use A as what we call as an oracle. So this means C may request A from A signatures of messages that depend on previously obtained message signature pairs. So that is, first C would receive a signature message and a signature pair, and it would compose another message and request that from A to be signed. And further getting this information, it can build and sort of an underlying understanding of the digital signature scheme and try to break it. So these are some of the ways these digital signature schemes may be attacked from a cryptography point of view. Then, in addition to trying to breaking the digital signature scheme itself, there can also be other forms of forgeries perpetrated on a digital signature infrastructure. One of the basic ones is what we would identify as a total break. Here, what happens is the private key is known. A's private key is known. So again, we are still talking about an example where A and B are communicating, and we have a intermediary C that is trying to attack. So in this case, if C knows A's private key, then that means they can communicate with B as if it is A. So they can create signatures forging on behalf of A. Then another option is what we identify as universal forgery. And in universal forgery, what happens is C would find an efficient signing algorithm that can provide an equal way of constructing signatures on arbitrary messages. So it finds a way to create signatures, or it find a ways to creating these signatures for sort of arbitrary messages, but that can stand in place for signatures that are coming from A. Then in selective forgery, what we have is C would forge a signature for a particular message. So not just any random arbitrary messages, it would be able to forge the signature for a specific message itself. And in existential forgery, C would forge a signature for at least one message. Here, C doesn't have control over the message. Uh, it would just be able to create a signature, uh, but not for any particular message or not for any sort of targeted way of it. It would be a nuisance to it. It would mess up the communication and so on, or interaction. But other than that, it would not be a significant trouble there. So now, based on the types of attacks and forgeries and the basic properties that we have discussed so far, we can formulate a set of requirements that we want to have for digital signatures. So the first one is the digital signature, the signature that is created, its bit pattern, the message should depend on the message that is being signed. So if we use a particular message as an input, then that particular message should dictate what the signature should be. The signature should depend on the message as an input. The second part is the signature should have some unique information about the sender so that one, it can prevent forgery, but also it can prevent denial. So it should also have some unique information about the sender, about the user who is sending the message. Third, even if we have a very large message that we want to send, we should still be able to produce this digital signature in a relatively easy manner. So, because digital signatures are expected to be used quite frequently in communications, we cannot expect to spend quite a bit of computation and time to produce these digital signatures. So these digital signatures must be easily produced. So it should be easy to produce the digital signatures. Similarly, at the receiving end, they should be easy to recognize and verify. So both the signature creation part and the signature verification part, both of these things should be easy, should be relatively easy from a computational and time point of view. But even though they should be easy to produce and easy to verify, it should still be computationally infeasible to forge. So, the fact that we say the digital signature creation and verification functions should be easy and quick and all that, that doesn't mean they should be computationally easy. They should be computationally much more complex. So a third party should not be able to forge a digital signature either to create a new digital signature or to mess up with the message and still have the digital signature valid. So we don't want those things happening. And the last requirement that we would have or we would want to have is it should be possible to store this digital signature, particularly as a point of evidence or as a verification mechanism, along with the original message, the original piece of data. So if I'm sending a message and it has a corresponding digital signature, both of those things should be able to stored, and if needed, should be able to verifiable at a later point in time. Now let's talk about direct digital signatures. So the term direct digital signature refers to a digital signature scheme that involves only the communicating party. So that is the sender and the receiver, the source and the destination. And it is assumed that the destination knows the public key of the source, and the source will use its private key or its corresponding private key to create the signature. So the source would create the digital signature using the private key, and the corresponding public key would be known to the destination, and they would use that as part of verification. In this scenario, confidentiality can be provided sort of in addition to the digital signature layer. We can additionally provide another layer of confidentiality by providing another layer of encryption. So when we talk about digital signatures, we use the private key of the sender, and the public key of the sender can be used by the receiver to do the verification. But the message is still going as plain text. But if you want to ensure confidentiality in the mix, what we can do here is we can use encryption, and we can encrypt the entire message and the signature using a shared key. If we establish a shared key between the two entities, a symmetric encryption shared key, so what we would do is we would first take the message, we would produce a corresponding signature, and then as a next layer, we would do the encryption, and then the message and the signature would be communicated in the encrypted form. One of the main factors that is going to determine how successful this type of digital signature scheme would be is the security of the sender's private key. So, if a sender is placing a signature on a message, they are using their private key, and then they are sending it to the receiver, and they are verifying it with the public key. But if the sender can later say my private key was stolen, or somebody else has had access to my private key and they used it to send, then the overall scheme would fall apart, because that is something that we cannot solve in a cryptographic manner. That is something to do with if somebody shares a secret, that is something that cannot be controlled there, because it is that has already been shared. Like in certain environments we can have certain mechanisms, we can have certain administrative controls in terms of how private keys should be managed, how they should be protected under certain passwords or passphrases, how they should be stored, and so on. So there can be certain additional mechanisms that could be placed, but other than that, uh, uh, we cannot ensure something like that. So, for example, we can ask them to sort of verify on a regular basis the validity of these keys and so on. But other than these sort of administrative measures, if somebody can make such a claim, then that would be something impossible to challenge or manage. But other than that, still the overall scheme would still be valid in terms of providing the requirements that we earlier identified. So now let's look at some examples of different digital signature algorithms, digital signature schemes. Uh, the first one that we will look at is the El-Gamal digital signature scheme. And if you remember the El-Gamal encryption scheme, this is very much similar to the underlying basis is very much similar. The only difference being which keys are being used for what. So the basic El-Gamal scheme is the same, but we would use whereas we would use the private key for the signing purposes and the public key for the verification purposes, whereas we would use the private for encryption and public for decryption in the encryption scheme. Then another digital signature algorithm that is fairly common is the NIST digital signature algorithm that is published by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the USA, and it is particularly done as a federal standard in the USA. And this algorithm is known as the digital signature algorithm, or the DSA. And DSA makes use of SHA, or the secure hash algorithm, as a main part of it, to creating the hash part of the signature. So the DSA was originally proposed in the 90s, and it became a standard in late 2000s, and it was further updated late 90s and further updated in the 2000s as well. So if we think about the two approaches that we can have for digital signatures in under this scheme, we can have what is known as an RSA approach and a DSA approach. So the main difference being how the message is being sent and where we use sort of any form of encryption or not. So in the RSA approach, what we have is we would start with a message. So we start with a message that we want to send. Then we create a hash for the message. Then using the private key, we encrypt the hash, essentially creating the signature. Then we combine these two and send it across. Then the message is taken, the signature part is separated, and these two things are compared, and again using the public key there, and if they are equal, then it is assumed the signature is valid for the message that is received. So the message is independently and verified along with the received signature. In the DSA approach, what we have is the signature function. So not only, again, we would start with a message, and that would later be combined with the output of the operation. Again, we would go into creating a hash. Then the signature function would use the private key of the sender. But in addition to that, it would also use a global public key and also a random number generated for a particular, the random number k generated for a particular signature, and then the signature will be produced, and that would be combined with combined with the message and sent. And then at the receiving point, the message is received and a hash is produced. So at the receiving end, the hash code of the incoming message is generated. And this one plus the signature is also received. That is also received as an input for the verification. Then the verification function also uses the same global public key and the sender's public key. So, in a way, these two approaches, the RSA approach and the DSA approach, significantly differ in terms of their application of the underlying cryptographic principles. Even though they may still use an overall sort of similar approach in terms of verification and so on, they would still have significant differences also. One of the other important or common digital signature algorithms is what is known as the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm. And again, we are not going to go into much detail into these, but sort of the main thing that sort of defines this scheme is that we have a number of shared global variables, or we would start with a number of shared global variables that is both known to the sender and the receiver, both Bob and Alice, the sender and the receiver, both of them would know these two things. Then, based on this shared information, the shared parameters, first the signer would generate a public and private key pair. So the signer would generate a private public key pair using or having the shared public domain parameters as an input for that. Then we go about creating the hash value for the message. We would generate the hash value for the message, and then using the hash value, the private key that was created, and the domain parameters, the global domain parameters that we have, the signature will be generated. So at the point of generating the signature, we would use the global parameters, we would use the private key, and we would use the hash value of the message as inputs to generating the signature. Then at the point of verification, again, the verifier would use the signer's public key, the public key that was generated and shared back. So it would use the public key. It would use the domain parameters because the domain parameters were also available because it's the global domain parameters. Then it would use the signature components that was received also as part of the verification, and then it would do the verification there. We are not going to go into detail of the exact sort of detailed operation of these algorithms, but I'll be sharing some additional resources to that would talk about each of these digital signature schemes that we have discussed so far and we are discussing today, and you may refer to those to get a bit more understanding of these schemes. One of the latest digital signature schemes that is to come about recently is what is known as the RSA PSS, that is the RSA probabilistic signature scheme. It was introduced significantly recently compared to the others in 2009, and it is recommended as sort of the next generation signature schemes, and to be used as sort of in modern applications as we go forward. So again, for RSA PSS also, I will share some additional resources that you can refer and get a bit more understanding. So that brings us to the close of today's lesson. We have discussed about digital signatures today and identified some key properties that we would seek from having digital signatures, and some potentials for attacks and forgeries, and what are some of the requirements that we would have from digital signature algorithms in terms of to mitigate such issues. And we also went about the use of direct digital signatures and how they would work in a practical manner. We also briefly touched upon some digital signature schemes and algorithms, even though we didn't go into much details of those. You may refer to some of the additional shared materials and get a bit more understanding of that. In the upcoming lectures, we will go into some further applications of digital signatures potentially, certificates, for example, and few other topics as well. So until next time, thank you for joining in for today's lesson. See you. Bye.